It's a privilege to be here. I live in Altadena by Pasadena, and I drive every day to the Pacific Palisades. So if people ask me what I'm thankful for, the last couple of years I say podcast. And I have to feel like I kind of feel like a bit of a lurker, because one of the podcasts I consistently listen to has been the sermon here at Hollywood. And I always know that when I'm listening to a sermon, I'm only barely scratching the surface of what it means to be part of a spiritual community, but it's always been a blessing to me. So thank you for having me. And in some ways, I feel like I shouldn't be in this pulpit. Speaking of Ryan, but I will take this opportunity. And just want to say that I miss Ryan on my commutes. This morning, I'd like to take a few moments and reflect on meaning and hope. And I'd like to start with a couple stories from the reading from today's lectionary. The first one is a familiar story that we all grew up with, if you grew up in the church. Elijah on Mount Carmel, the big showdown. You know, he was in conflict, he was in hiding from Jezebel and Ahab. And so he finally gets a chance to put God to the test on Mount Carmel. And so he shows up there, him by himself, facing 140 priests of Baal. And they square off. And I just want to say this is an example. These two stories are examples of shortcuts to meaning. And in this first one, I think what we find is we find someone who comes a bit late to the realization that he's taken a shortcut. So we find that here that someone who's been in hiding, Elijah, he watches the priest of Baal as they struggle to get their offering to be accepted by Baal. He taunts them, perhaps your God is sleeping. And then he gets his opportunity. And he has them pour water over the altar and over the calves. And he calls down fire, and everything, including the fire, including the water, is consumed. It's a moment of victory. Here's a man who's been hiding from these people, hiding from Jezebel. And here's the representation of Jezebel and what she's been doing to his people, to his religion. And in this moment of ecstasy, this moment when he finally has the power, he goes out on his own and he calls for the death of 140 people. If God had wanted to kill those priests, he could have done it when the fire came down from heaven. Jezebel finds out about what happened. And it's almost like when I read this, when you read about Elijah hearing about Jezebel coming after him to kill him, to treat him as he treated her priest. It's like when you wake up from a dream. As a parent, it's usually a dream that's involved maybe one of my kids, and the dream hasn't ended well. And I wake up to relief that it was a dream. But in this situation, Elijah wakes up, and it wasn't a dream. And there are 140 bodies that he has to account for. And so he runs. He runs, but an angel catches up with him and sends him up to Mount Sinai. And he complains, he says, I am no better than my forefathers. I've gone beyond what God has called me to do. He realizes too late that somehow in his spiritual journey, he was finding his meaning in competition with people that were different from him. And when he had the opportunity, when he had the chance, when he had the power, he took it and he destroyed his enemy. He treated them less than human. Ephraim the Syrian, a 4th century hymnist and theologian, says, that in the revelation on Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, God attempts to correct Elijah's excessive zeal and to lead him to imitate, according to righteousness, the providence of the Most High, who regulates the judgments of his justice through the abundance of mercy and grace. Even in the 4th century, they knew that this route to meaning was a shortcut. The creating of enemies to give you purpose is not the meaning that we are called to. The second story that we read in our reading for today is another very familiar story for many people. It's the story of Jesus and the disciples crossing the sea, and they arrive on the shore after the storm, and it's almost like a movie. They step out onto the shore and they step into a cemetery. You can see the headstones. Maybe there's a little early morning clouds hanging low. And perhaps in the background, a shadow sliding from headstone to headstone. They find themselves in a cemetery inhabited by a demon-possessed man running around without any clothes. And if you remember the story, Christ calls out to the demons, and he sends them into a herd of pigs that then dive into the sea and kill themselves. And the response of the pig herders was to run back to the city to tell them what had happened. And when I always read this story before, I always read it in a sense that they saw this man come in, and he took their livelihood away. He killed all their pigs. We got to do something about this. It was almost a story about, valuing their business, their wealth above this individual. But as I was reading through the commentaries, René Girard has a reading of the story that I'd never heard before. A story where this demoniac is a scapegoat. Think about our society. Think about the groups within our society. How easy is it for us to pick a scapegoat, to help to give some definition to our lives? It might depend on which side of the aisle, the political aisle you stand on, as to who those scapegoats are. Is it the big corporations? Is it the illegal immigrants? Is it them? Is it them? What group do we blame for the situation that we find ourselves in? Shortcuts to meaning. And so what does Jesus do with this demoniac? This man in the reading of Girard's telling of this story, who in some way is perhaps the boogeyman for this whole community. The one that the moms and dads tell their kids to stay inside because you know who lingers out in that cemetery. The one that's interesting that it says that he continually gets freed from his chains and they have to go back and recapture him and chain it back up. Who are the heroes in this city who are there protecting their city from this demoniac? If he's such a threat, why don't they just kill him? But no, they need this scapegoat. They need this other to define who they are, to say, well, that's not us. And so what does Jesus do? I love this part. Of course, this man who's been the scapegoat for this community wants to go with Jesus. But what does Jesus do? He sends him back and says, no, go back into your community. What happens when the boogeyman moves next door? What happens when you see him walk out in his bathrobe to pick up his newspaper? You see the pizza delivery get to come to his door. He waves at you in the morning. What happens when the monster becomes a person. It becomes part of your community. Another reading from today's lectionary comes from Galatians 3. I'll read verses 23 to 29. Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. For in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. There are no monsters. There are no scapegoats. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. One of the commentaries said that we have an easy time with the big words, sanctification, justification. It's the small words, like grace, the small words like all, that we find a challenge. For this generation, there's always another outsider that we are called to make part of the all. Purpose and meaning. These shortcuts to meaning have other effects. When we begin to draw the battle lines, we begin to dig in, there's no more need to search and to explore. Our role is to defend and wall in. When we come into contact with the people that are the other, that are our enemies, we don't talk. We fire our theological shots across their bows. Where is God in that? As I read through these stories, there were a couple conversations that were going through my head. As I said, I'm very thankful at this point for podcasts. And one podcast in particular that I find very meaningful is one, perhaps you've heard of it, called On Being, with the host Krista Tippett. And she interviews scientists, theologians, poets. And the ones I like to listen to are the hour-and-a-half unedited discussions, like a fly on the wall of people exploring what it means to be human, what it means to live. And recently there have been two conversations that have been bouncing around in my head. The first is Krista Tippett's interview with Father Gregory Boyle. And the other one is with a poet, Marie Howe. And I read these stories and I saw and was thinking about these shortcuts to meaning. How we use people, how we take individuals, we take groups, and we make them less than human for our own benefit. To make it so we don't have to challenge ourselves. So we can feel comfortable where we are. And I loved in your reading today, grant us justice, O God. Take up our case against faithless systems. Because that's who our battle's with, isn't it? It's with these systems. Maybe I shouldn't say battle, I should say struggle. Our struggle to free those who are under the heels of the system, and to free those also who are defending the systems, who don't know what they're defending and are too afraid to let go. As you know, Father Gregory Boyle works with gang members in East LA. And as he was interviewed, he had he was sharing his experience of what these gang members have done for him. And he says he's been studying recently the Acts of the Apostles. And as he read it, he said the thing that jumped out of him as he read through the early church descriptions in there was that, and it says in the Acts, and awe came upon everyone. And he says, so that the measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. So how can we really seek a compassion that can stand in awe at what people have to carry, rather than stand in judgment and how they carry it? As he told the stories related by these gang members, he said what he's learned, or maybe what he's just grown into, is to stand in awe of these individuals. And not just these individuals, but every individual. At Glendale City Church, where I currently attend, we just started a Sabbath school group called the Living Project. And we thought we'd start it out by getting to know each other and just telling stories, just to kind of build community. And we were getting ready to move away from telling stories, and everyone said, no, we're not done. We want to tell, we want to listen. People I have gone to church with for years, people who I haven't talked to, I might have shaken their hands at the greetings in the morning. They had to look to them. I might have created my own background for who they are. And they tell their stories, and we have to stand in awe. We stand in awe for what these individuals carry. We fight our urge to begin to start on the outside and to judge them for how they live, rather than to get to know them and be amazed by what they've come through and where they are. Father Gregory Boyle says that when it comes down to it, what he finds in these gang members, these ex-gang members, is a lack of hope. A hope for something, a hope for a future. And as I listened to him and as I read these stories this morning, I wondered, what is it that we can hope for? Of course, as Christians, we have the eternal hope of that day that will come in the future. But maybe all that we can really hope for now is to be known, to be seen. What does that mean to a young man or woman whose society has written off? To be seen by a community for who they are, for what they have to offer. Maybe not in some big way, not in some fancy job, but just as part of that community. To connect at that level. Alice Miller, child psychologist, talked about the fact that we're all called to be enlightened witnesses. People who, through their kindness and tenderness and focused attempts of love, return people to themselves, and in the process, a return to themselves. God calls us to reject any reaction on our part to make someone less than human. To let someone else carry our load by making them our scapegoat. Instead, he calls us to open out to the world. Marie Howe talks about the death of her brother, who died in the 80s in his mid-late 20s from AIDS. And she said as she suffered there, she said she finally had to allow her heart to break open. And when it broke open, she turned around and found herself with a million other people, with millions of other people, with broken hearts. As we make our scapegoats and we make our monsters, we deny ourselves the fact that we are part of the all, that we are part of the community that is humanity. And so what is it that we do as humans, as Christians? Where do we find our purpose and meaning? Where do we find and share our hope? Father Gregory Boyle talks about the desert fathers and mothers and how when the times seemed darkest, the mantra that they had in their meditations was today, today. Just be present today. And he talks about an off-Broadway play that he has fallen in love with the title of it and has made it his mantra. And the title is, Now Hear This. Now, N-O-W. Hear, H-E-R-E, this. Hear, period. Now, period. Let me go back. Now, period. Here, period. This. As Christians, we are called to be present. Now. Here. And with this. It's so easy to escape to the distractions. The systems that wreak havoc on our world seem too big. They seem unchangeable. They seem unassaultable. Now, here, this. We aren't called to be saviors of the world. We're just called to be present with our neighbors. And when we do that, perhaps the walls will begin to fall. Marie Howe writes this poem. It's called The Gate. I had no idea that the gate I would step through to finally enter this world would be the space my brother's body made. He was a little taller than me, a young man, but grown. Himself by then, done at 28, having folded every sheet, rinsed every glass he would ever rinse under the cold and running water. This is what you have been waiting for, he used to say to me. And I'd say, what? And he'd say this, holding up my cheese and mustard sandwich. And I'd say, what? And he'd say, this, sort of looking around. Now, here, and this is what we've been waiting for, what we've been called to be present to the person who you feel on your shoulder now, the person whose hand you squeezed a few minutes ago, whose shoulders you hugged. This is our community. This is your community. And it's here where we begin to break down our fear of the monsters and the scapegoats. And instead we find our brothers and our sisters. Amen.